Hello again. So we are carrying on with our thoughts on various aspects of the sacred liturgy, and I'd like to look into a few concrete sectors today, beginning with the body. There is available a treatise on the place of the body in worship given by the great liturgical expert Romano Guardini, who was one of the main figures in the liturgical movement and therefore somebody who gave impetus to the document that gave us eventually our liturgy as we have it right now, Sacro Sacrum Concilium, in the Council. And he was also a great influence on the likes of Joseph Ratzinger, who actually makes appeal to him. And indeed it would seem that he dedicated his magisterial work on the spirit of the liturgy indirectly to him by taking up the title that he would have given to a seminal work that he wrote way back. And the spirit of the liturgy is something, therefore, that this man was very much aware of and wanted to inculcate in the church at large, and therefore all he says is valid. He has written, therefore, this treatise on this one aspect of bodily participation in worship, and it is very concrete. It is split up into short chapters, often of only a page or so each, but dealing completely, succinctly, and profoundly with the issue in question each time. And if we're not aware of the fact that each is worthy of a chapter, it means that we are not aware of what we are doing automatically on a daily basis in our liturgical operations, which can apply also to our devotional ones, because there is an overlap, and the way we do one will be the way, therefore, that we will tend to do the other. All that pertains to God participates in the virtue of religion. The word comes from religare, to bind, and it binds us to the Blessed Trinity by the engagement of our faculties and also of our bodily movements and capacities. The difference between our liturgy and that of what has come out of the Catholic Church in the Protestant Reform is that ours has maintained the incarnational aspect of worship. They have tended to emphasize what they would refer to as the biblical worship in spirit and in truth, making abstraction to a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent, of bodily participation, because in practice, often it is, with the exception of music, and therefore the voice box and that other sensual element of worship, their worship tends to be otherwise pretty cerebral, that is, the mind and the emphasis on the word. And the position of the body varies very little, usually, not always, but very little. Whereas we do engage all the time the body, so we want to look at some concrete aspects of that engagement. Let us start with the sign of the cross. I shall quote now from this author fairly extensively because he says it quite well and in fairly understandable terms. When we cross ourselves, he says, let it be with a real sign of the cross. Instead of a small cramped gesture that gives no notion of its meaning, let us make a large, unhurried sign, from forehead to breast, from shoulder to shoulder, consciously feeling how it includes the whole of us, our thoughts, our attitudes, our body and soul, every part of us at once, how it consecrates and sanctifies us. In the Cistercian rite, the signing at the Gospel is done with the signing of the page and the signing once only of the whole body, with a big Cistercian cross of the whole body. In the Roman rite, the one that we have ourselves, it is done with the signing of the book, and then of the forehead, indicating the mind wanting to engage with the word and giving its assent. On the mouth, the lips, indicating that we then must be willing to proclaim not only its praise but also its message. And then on the breast, the heart, indicating the affective bonding with the Logos and the assent of the whole person. We love the Lord that we hear, and we give our loving attention to every word coming from his mouth. So these can be done automatically and without any attention, or they can be made to be, as it were, the expression of the being. This is a fundamental notion in all that pertains to liturgy, the expression of. The French Benedictine school would maintain that the very fact of performing well certain sacred acts, even should the person be distracted, has by its own merit the essence of genuine praise already, for it is a social giving place and honour and space and time to the Creator. Therefore it has a role. But they would maintain that it is far better if one has what we refer to as the ex opere operantis element coming in. Now, let's get this straight. There are two things at work. If the liturgy accomplishes a sacramental act, that is, surrounds the holy sacrifice of the Mass, well, that holy sacrifice is present before our eyes. It is happening, as we say in theology, ex opere operato, from the work worked. But if, in addition to that, the priest and the people are fully engaged mentally and affectively, then there is the lustre of ex opere operantis being added to the beauty of the liturgy. It's no longer just a theatrical performance. It is genuine expression of heartfelt praise. So the angels who are gathering up our prayer and praise have more to offer up. It was shown to one mystic soul way back centuries ago how the angels, sometimes hovering over the monks, had great bundles to carry up into the rafters and into heaven, very engaged minds and hearts, brethren truly praising and worshipping and engaged with all their being. Others had a mediocre package to carry up, and others, alas, had nothing whatsoever, because they were quite absent from what they were doing. As a body, the monastic choir was carrying on the worship, and that was its role at that time, and it ought to be there, but there was a great inequality with regard to what was actually going up in the eyes of the angels. It can apply also to us. God is pleased by what God himself does at the altar. The holy sacrifice is the work of Christ. But how much more pleased again is he when he finds hearts engaged and not just a beautiful shell. It is not enough, although it is already something, to produce good music. If all the attention of the being is given to the production of the music, then there is something hugely missing with regard to the very function of liturgy. It has to be an expression of and not an end in itself. And so, with regard to this simple beginning and ending of our prayer, the sign of the cross should be well done. Indeed, not that far away from us in time, we have that message given to mankind here in the West, when we had, in 1858, Our Lady intervening at Lourdes. She appeared to this little damsel, and when it came to making the sign of the cross, which she was instinctively going to do before she started the rosary, she found that her arm was blocked. It wouldn't move. And then she was shown, the Blessed Virgin, making the sign of the cross, how it should be done, top to bottom, and the whole being covered with dignity and unhastily. In the Carthusian Rite, there are various elements often coming from the East. the cross is made with the whole body, but also it's made with Eastern style. They have fingers united in such a way that the Blessed Trinity is represented, and also the humanity. One sees it sometimes in old pictures of Pope's blessings. And then they also had and still have the inclination of the head. After making the sign of the cross, a big, wide, huge cross over the whole body, they also make a slight inclination of the head automatically afterwards. Out of what? Out of respect for the cross of Christ, which they have just produced over their body. So there's a double gesture each time a Carthusian makes the sign of the cross. The sign of the cross initiates many sacred acts. It still is there at the beginning of our celebrations. In the old instructions given to the priest, in the Mass as it was until the changes, once the priest, even on his own, had made that first sign of the cross and said the Trinitarian formula, he was at that point onwards already celebrating Mass and could not stop it for any reason whatsoever, and could not answer anything else, could not in any way interrupt it. The Mass had started from that point on, and that would make sense in the wider context of the many prayers to be said before he got to that point. It's not just as it is now. There was a gradual dovetailing into, and even preparation in the sacristy, obligatory. And so that was the point at which there was to be no return. And should the celebration be stopped after the consecration, the Mass had to carry on by the bringing in of another priest. It couldn't stop in mid-air once the consecration had happened. In the Old Rite too, we find more than one cross being made in the beginning of Mass. There are different points, and the historic reason for that is that what the Council of Trent actually did was to keep what they found. That meant they kept anything venerable coming from the various strands of liturgical tradition and family which went into what was around at the time, which meant that in practice there were about three starts, three different rites, three families of liturgy, which in the Missal of 1570 are collated and conflated. They are actually kept together so that if one looks carefully at the beginning of the Mass as it was until the changes in 1969, the priest is starting about three times. It's interesting because each one would have been a separate start. That's to explain what actually happened in the mind of the Council Fathers, and as Paul VI put it in his general instruction, and already it's actually there embryonically in the document itself of the Vatican Council, the intention was to get back to the linear movement, the clarity of the broad outlines, as in a Gothic cathedral, which has acquired too much over the centuries to leave clear the main thrusts, to see what the structure of liturgy as it would have been coming down the centuries in one of the families at least, not all three put together. The same pattern emerges right through actually the Old Rite, that whereas now we have one formula for each thing, quite often as one goes through one sees emerging one or two or three. Therefore one is putting side by side different prayers as they came along, making it actually very heavy with regard to the number of words, just to understand what the thrust was in the reform of the Second Vatican Council. The sign of the cross then, he goes on, it sanctifies us, he says, it consecrates us. It does so because it is the sign of the universe and the sign of our redemption. Now, Pope Benedict XVI has actually come into this question here. He is someone who is very much interested in the spirituality of the liturgy and its history, and he does indicate very clearly that in East and West, the orientation of the liturgical prayer is eastward. Now, in practice, that is physical and was perceived as such even in the early church. We see it in early church fathers. They do speak of this element, and it is a waiting for the Christ the returning King, the dawn of history, at the end of time, the Alpha and the Omega coming on the clouds, prefigured for us in the rising of the sun, hence the orientation of churches. And he indicates that there is an unbroken tradition, that the thrust, therefore, of worship is all in one direction, not one facing the other, but all together facing Christ, the Alpha and the Omega. And then he goes into the problem of the new orientation, which is one facing the other, which is not actually a reproduction of the early orientation, but it's a would-be reproduction of the Last Supper. But actually it's not a correct one, because as we know, the Last Supper was not celebrated on the kind of table arrangement that we have. We have the evidence in the Gospels that the beloved disciple was reclining on the breast of the Lord. That is a hint that they were using the triclinium system, where there would be these three tables, possibly with an open end so that the service could take place, and they were able then to be one next to the other, allowing the possibility of having one close to the Lord himself and able to recline. It's not exactly what we have when we try to reproduce our present way of thinking of eating together and thinking that therefore we're getting back to the early church. It's not quite so simple. So in that respect, what we have now is not a reproduction of the early church, but a putting into our terms of what we think of as the Last Supper, as we would do it in our day. Now, Benedict therefore tries to get over the problem of this new arrangement, which also has had the effect of having the virtual thrust and orientation as being in a different direction, one towards the other, in interaction and dialogue, and not all in one direction going outwards of ourselves towards God and up high, as something which has to be hit through some equivalent of orientation towards a virtual orient, a virtual east, and he suggests that the way to do it would be to have the cross precisely as the point of encounter and attention, so that we're not actually engaging with each other at that point of encounter with God, but in some way reminded that we're both on both sides heading in the same direction, in that sense meeting Christ in the midst, but in a virtual orient. So he invites towards having this prominent cross, even if we are now in this arrangement of facing each other. And he does point out also that all liturgical celebration in any case is orientated in that vertical, if you like, eastward plane, because it's all going towards God. Otherwise it's not actual liturgy, it's encounter of man. And that is a debasing of the service of God into, as it were, a hijacking of what is divine in order to honour man. And the culmination of that would be when we start chatting during the liturgy and even applauding performance of liturgy, because if that is happening, the revelation of the truth is quite clear. It is no longer for God's glory, but for man. And the liturgy has become an end in itself in which we are gratified. So it's a grave abuse of the throne of God to place man in any way in a situation of applaudability and appreciation on the level of performance. We're not there for that. Concerts are for that. Liturgy is for gratuitous praise in which God alone is applauded, but in the way that he wishes. All that to say that the cross has come back then through that orientation of wanting in some way to get away from two eyes meeting, so that we actually look in a different direction by this reminder that we meet someone else, and we're there to meet that someone else, not each other. He indicates that the first part of the liturgical celebration, the Mass itself, is indeed a dialogue. It's up to and including the sermon. There we are genuinely engaged, and there should be, as it were, a contact on the level of the eyes. Certainly a heart-to-heart contact, and the personality does enter in. And if that is not happening, that is poor liturgy, but for a different reason altogether. He indicates from the moment of the offertory on, the thrust is different and needs to be felt to be different. So whatever the physical posture, the internal posture has to be completely vertical from that moment on. Indeed, the word sursum corda, lift up your hearts, goes back to the early church in every liturgy and does imply that from this point on we are not of this earth, we are with the angels, and we are heading for the Trisagion, the thrice holy God, Hagios, 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 Sanctus, 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 Holy, 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 echoing the song of the angels. That, if it's not happening, is unfortunately an indication that we don't know what we're doing and what we're there for. So the cross then enters into it, and indeed already in the early church there was the use of the cross in private houses as it were an indication of the virtual orient, and that can happen in our own places of prayer at home. It is good to have some point where God claims his space, some element of the sacrality visibly seen and perceived in our own home or wherever it may be, so that in a certain angle of our home, our place of abode, only one thing happens, and God can be honoured there, and it can be a place of perceived grace. There are places that we return to willingly, where we have been consoled and talked to before, where the Bible will be honoured. It can be placed in a little throne and also covered with things which honour God. An icon also, in which there might be something physically burning, a lamp or a tea light. These are all ways of allowing God to have his claim over time and space, and which can be the virtual orient in our own place of being. And it's also important to be aware that if we do not have a place of that nature where we are, then the danger is that all will be neutral, that there will be not a time or a place in our life where that is happening. And it is not enough just to go to church. There has to be that supplement of it in our private life, so that we're not just having the bones of the spiritual life. Liturgy alone is the maximum and the culmination, but it is not sufficient. And to think that we have done our duty by, for instance, daily Mass, is not actually to understand the nature of the spiritual life. It is to nourish our spiritual life, not to be that, the spiritual life, beginning and ending with that alone, unprepared and unthanked for. Grace has to be absorbed. And if one loses much energy in going, for instance, to a daily Mass, but one has not time for anything else at all with regard to quiet prayer in one's life, it can be very unbalanced and not sufficient, because our life already is made up of much running and hurrying and trying to beat the clock. So if our only encounter with God is more of the same thing, often accompanied by much talk and chatter before, after, and if we're not careful, even during, then it is quite insufficient. We need that element of also engagement in serenity of heart, mind, and, yes, body. Therefore, that comes into it as well. Even at home, the body enters into it, and it is quite different to be, as it were, casually encountering and sitting in some comfy chair, and actually physically adoring with our whole being, because the liturgic element has also its repercussions on the way we generally approach our God. It makes a difference when the body is in a posture of receptivity, littleness, mendicity, tininess, openness, and in general nothingness before its maker, whereas it's sitting down, it's doing more of the same thing, and we can actually kid ourselves. It matters a lot when it comes to if we are engaged either with the rosary or with the divine office. The posture of the body matters an awful lot, because if it is truly engaging, it is engaging physically and visibly, and the fruit of the act is far greater, because we are honouring God with our whole being. One wonders why, only in some 40 years, the habit, which used to be in Ireland, of kneeling for the rosary at home, often against some little chair, has gone now through the window, often in favour, if we do it at all, of sitting comfortably. It's not the same, because one is an act of physical sacrifice and worship, the other is an act of getting through something, as the one will get through another act of the day. Just to say, the body has its role, and if it is not used, then it remains, as it were, a Protestant worship, only the mind, words and more words. So I just conclude this section on the sign of the cross, which Cardini gives us. He indicates that we begin and end many acts with this. It's a good thing when we are eating to make the sign of the cross and to ask the Lord's blessing when we begin, and also to thank Him at the end and to conclude with some sign of the cross, either asking for the repose of the faithful departed as classically done, or simply just concluding with the sign of the cross, invoking the Blessed Trinity. But that opening and closing makes the meal also a sacred act and sets it away from just the McDonald's banal eating of fodder, as though we were some kind of beast to be kept going physically alone. The recognition of the rights of the Creator is actually perceived very much so on that coming apart, even as a family or as brethren, to receive well. And the monastic way of doing it is actually a paraliturgy. It extends what happens in choir. Indeed, there is an ancient tradition that one comes straight from one to the other. The refectory is built parallel to the church, and one comes from the office to the refectory. One bows to the cross, again, a big cross, and then there are prayers sung or chanted. And, interestingly enough, the priest who has consecrated the host as main celebrant will be the one who will preside over, that is, will bless the meal following the Eucharist. That is, the midday meal, the main one will be his to bless, and if normally, as it would happen, he would also have the Vespers, and he has presided over Vespers, he will also bless the evening meal. If another priest has, it will be for him to bless the evening meal. That's the ancient tradition, indicating the, as it were, agape notion of the meal. Ubi missa, ibi mensa. Where there is master, there is also a meal, a mensa, a table following. It happens in station masses in Ireland, it happens in groups. Often we have a cup of tea and so on after we have prayed the Lord, indicating our fellowship. But that should be done in a continuous mode of sacrality. It shouldn't be an immediate explosion of noise after we've come from the holy table of the Lord Himself. There should be that element of fellowship in a sacred sharing afterwards. And that can be a good blend, because we need fellowship. And if we lose quite a few not too fervent Catholics to Protestant sects and various denominations here and there, it's often because we do not offer them that same element of fellowship which the human soul needs, not to be going through life as an anonymous ant on the globe, forgotten and just a number. We need each other, and it is important that that be felt in fellowship coming from the holy table. We do not treat each other badly and expect to honour the Lord in that way. So, that element then of also bringing up the sacred sharing, companis, to eat with, is actually to take one's bread with, and one is a companion, a bread eater with, of those on the road. Companionship is a sacred notion. We need each other. So, other things also we know in the early church were accompanied by the sign of the cross. In the East, one sees often, if one goes to a really Eastern Orthodox country, how many signs of the cross are made. They pass a little icon by the street, on the side of the street. They will make 3 signs of the cross always, and also in church they're forever making signs of the cross. And they make them quite well, and often actually they make them also with a slight touching of the ground. They have this element of proskunesis coming in. The body is engaged in the East. Of course, that is an Oriental thing anyway, and we must remember that our liturgy has very strong Oriental roots anyway, coming from the pre-Christian situation in which it is born. But they tend to maintain things more physically complete in the East. We in the West have a certain clinical notion. We have vestiges of rites. For instance, when it comes to baptizing, they will plunge the baby completely 3 times in water. And when it comes to anointing, they really go to town. We tend to be somewhat clinical and content ourselves with just a vestige. Anyway, here he concludes, we make the sign of the cross before we pray, to collect and compose ourselves, and to fix our minds and hearts and wills upon God. We make it when we finish praying, in order that we may hold fast the gift we have received from God. In temptations we sign ourselves to be strengthened. By the way, St. Teresa of Avila saw the effect of the sign of the cross when it came to temptation. It did drive away the demons, but actually after a while they tended to come back. She found that what really put them at bay was holy water. When it was properly blessed, exorcised, it really had a huge effect, and they didn't come back. It's a good thing to have holy water in one's house and to use it. The demon doesn't like it one little bit. But it should be kept well, that is, not allowed to become gangrene. It's awful when it's just left there. It ought to be clean and crystal, pure, as it were, indicating baptismal waters, not something just left stagnant, which suggests nothing less than the demon himself. We make it when we finish praying, in order that we may hold fast the gift we have received from God. In temptation, we sign ourselves to be strengthened, in dangers to be protected. There is a story told before the collapse of the communist regime that there was a bus going somewhere on the road in Russia, and this gentleman in the bus found himself next to a bearded man, and he hadn't noticed him before, he didn't know where this came from. He started to talk to him, wondering who he was. And this bearded man muttered something to the effect that the reign of Satan was soon to be ended in Russia. And the other man, who was well brought up by the communist regime, was starting to poke fun at him and was indicating where he was coming from. Then, as they were going along, there was this almighty bang, and something went hugely wrong, and everyone on the bus, to a man, made 3 signs of the cross. And the gentleman indicated what the situation actually was in Russia and disappeared. It was understood that it was St. Nicholas who had appeared and given indication before the communist collapse that things weren't actually that different deep down in the Russian soul. A little parenthesis. By the way, it's interesting, one can see Putin in church. He behaves very well as regards liturgical prayer. Interesting how instincts carry on, often through the grandmother who's handed on the faith to the little children. I close that parenthesis, but it's all linked with the sign of the cross, common to east and west, even though the direction is the other way around in the east. It is the cross of our salvation, the cross also that will be seen at the end of time. When the Lord says the sign of the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, it is thought that he means the cross, hugely visible all over the planet one day. Now, I just conclude this section here. The cross is signed upon us in blessings, in order that the fullness of God's life may flow into the soul and fructify and sanctify us wholly. I've often had testimonies of the power of a well-executed and interiorized blessing. Things happen. Sometimes people really are affected and they feel a certain warmth. They actually are somehow being touched by the hand of Christ, by a genuinely executed and prayed blessing. Hence it is that it is grave for children, for instance, to be deprived of that when they have every right to at Mass. It's not correct that they should be going to a non-priest to receive some kind of gesture which would be assimilated to a blessing. A deacon also has that possibility, and it is for them to be doing this act of, as it were, supplementing the grace of Holy Communion for children at underage. I mean, people under 7 or 8 in Ireland need the grace as much as anyone else, and that is doable on the correct terms. We do not just allow the children to go out without anything at all. It is not fair. And therefore, this is a part of what we have to hand on to children. They need to be touched by Christ because they are still very pure, and the blessing of a priest can have a deep effect on them when it is done properly, as it can also upon people who are sick. One time when I was in Rome, the rector of the college I was staying with at the time, who was a missionary and spent all his life in Africa, he was coming out one day with this in a homily: we priests do not realize the power that we have. And he indicated this story which just came out of the blue. He was there one day in darkest Africa, and this lady brought her dying child to him. There was no hope whatsoever, little in the way of clinics and medicine out there, so she was resigned to the will of God. But maybe Father could give one last blessing, which he did with great attention and love and intensity. And his comment was, "Now, that child is a fine, healthy young man." And indeed, it is said that Our Lady has commented on the fact that she cannot do what a priest can do with regard to blessing. She has indicated, it would seem, that the power of the blessing of the priest is something else and needs to be taken seriously. Therefore, to deprive children of that blessing by stepping into the place of a priest is not correct. The priest needs to bless and also to be having some kind of physical contact with people, the sick, the children. Those who are in some way in need of being healed can be healed already by the warm, tender touch of Christ coming through his consecrated hands. A layman cannot do that. We can always pray for a person, but to confer a blessing is not the same as to ask for a blessing. The priest does not just ask for a blessing, he blesses. Christ blesses in his hands, and that has power. Now, I just conclude. Think of these things when you make the sign of the cross. It is the holiest of all signs. Make a large cross, taking time, thinking what you do. Let it take in your whole body, your whole being. Body, soul, mind, will, thoughts, feelings. Your doing and not doing. And by signing it with the cross, it strengthens and consecrates the whole of your being in the strength of Christ, in the name of the triune God. Now, all that to say that we have power and we do not think of it. And by the way, it is still maintained in the Handbook of Indulgences given by Paul VI, which is still valid to our time, the Enchiridion Indulgentiarum, that the taking of holy water, accompanied by the sign of the cross and the Trinitarian formula, gains each time an indulgence. That would be a partial indulgence, and a partial indulgence operates like this, that the Church adds, in exact proportion to our merit from its treasury. That is to say that according to our devotion and intensity, also we have the double coming from the Church itself. So if we do it distractedly, we have very little coming to us. If we do it with intention, we have all the treasury of the Church coming in also. And we gain a lot of merit. We have forgiveness of the consequences thereof many things. We are washed, as the suggestion would be, in water. It has the effect of taking away venial sin when done intensely and truly, and also taking away what is due. That is, in proportion to our devotion. It's important that we think about these things, because often we have grace, power, merit at our hands, and we are not plugged in. They're passing by in vain. As Augustine said, the great St. Augustine, I fear the Lord passing, timeo dominum transiuntem. He's passing, and we're not clasping and grasping him. The same with his graces. We're surrounded on all sides, and we do not grasp the blessing as it goes. So we'll break there for a little music, and we'll come back to the next section in a few seconds. So, what we do in liturgy has to express what we are actually accomplishing. We are reproducing the song of the angels, and we are reproducing an atmosphere which does not pertain to this world. That this has been picked up in the charismatic celebration there of Padre Legrua is one thing, but that it should be picked up more recently in this analysis of the sound made by crickets is something else. Here it is just a neutral context, and it is actually science indicating that there's more around us than meets the eye. These are modern instruments able to slow down things to a perceptible pulse. We know that dogs and other animals hear things that we cannot. Indeed, I have here in the Hermitage a means of discouraging strongly mice from coming here. They are things that electronically are put into the air, and we cannot hear, but they can, and it makes them feel very uncomfortable, and they run away. Supersonic sounds. Well, these sounds have been slowed down on the recording, and we can actually hear what seems to be angelic purity in some kind of harmony unknown and unproducible here on earth. What is going on? It would seem to indicate that actually there is a harmony in creation beyond our comprehension, that there is actually some, as it were, natural orientation of nature towards the praise of God. It is all one whole, and it would seem, what was there in the peace of Eden, that paradisiac beauty, tranquility, and order and harmony which was lost at the fall, but which is not entirely lost in nature. Nature functions as a whole unconsciously. In our liturgy, we make conscious what they do unconsciously. We are the conscious voice of creation. We sing the praise of all the creatures. That is, of course, something that is formalized in our liturgy. Every Gloria Patri should be that. And every canticle of creation, e.g. at Lord's on a Sunday, should be that. We are giving voice to all the creatures under heaven. And that is something that we need to bear in mind when we come into any form of liturgical prayer. We are at that point acting as priests of creation. In virtue of our baptism, we are the voice, but that voice is out there. Indeed, in the Hermitage, one is very much aware of the concelebration of the praise of God in the early hours, when the birds are at it very early in the summer, and one is praising God with them, they unconsciously and we consciously, but the same praise of creation coming back to its creator. Liturgy then is something priestly, but also something angelic. Therefore, only the best. With regard to instructions given by the Vatican for what is the best, it is quite clear. It is not in any way blinkered, because God is God and what is Catholic is universal, and therefore it is able to be enculturated into all kinds of situations and take the best of what is in Africa as in the best of e.g. Wales, where they take on four-part harmony instinctively. The culture is elevated and not in any way destroyed, and so the best is taken, but the best. And it's not enough to take just the culture and not the best of it, because that is actually presuming that we can somehow make what is not really elevating. What we are doing is engaging in another mode, and it's happening far too much. What I'm getting at is this: we are actually in the presence of the angels, and they are offended by loud noise, by something which is jarring, distracting, and drawing attention to itself, because liturgy then is becoming its own God, and taking away from true praise and worship, it's drawing attention to itself. Now, that's kind of important, because in the place of natural contemplation, liturgy usually happens spontaneously well. People just know what is pleasing. The problem is that in many of our liturgical assemblies, people in a responsible position will perhaps not have that interior life that should accompany it. Therefore, they're more open to illusion with regard to what liturgy is about, and they have power. A person in charge of a choir has power, for good or for bad. It's kind of important, because we can't presume that we can do easily on earth what the angels have taken all eternity to practice. I'd just like to conclude this little section, which is a section of its own, with one point. It's this: liturgy is serene. That is the key. Music which is not serene, interiorized, in some way able to carry us, is not liturgical. Liturgy which is actually in some way exteriorized is unable to serve God and the soul. It is too invasive. We need in some way to find some cloud which carries us, not something which sucks us in. in that sense, only the person who is truly in love with the Lord Jesus can be called a liturgist. He cannot be just a musician. He cannot be just an expert in history. He cannot be a technician of instruments. Only a person who is a contemplative will in some way spontaneously know how the angels would pray and have us pray with them. So I just end this tiny little parenthesis with that. Liturgy, if it's serene, is pleasing to God and the angels. Noise is pleasing to the demon, for hell is full of noise.